So we can get started, and I will just turn it over to Bruce and let you go ahead.
Okay, good morning, folks. Everyone able to hear me okay? Thumbs up will be fine on the screen if you got your camera. Good deal. So in talking to Dave about the request, and this was kind of thrown out there as an ad hoc thing, and I got voluntold to do it. I'm not necessarily advocating for digital. I'm not necessarily promoting this. I would like to go out and be able to answer basic questions, get people started, things like that. One of the prerequisites on this, if you're trying to follow along or at least look on your own computer while we're playing and doing, and I know it's being recorded so we can look at this later, but the expectation obviously is that you've got the application on your computer, you've got some sort of an interface which is able to go out and key your radio, send audio through it, which is what generates the signal, and then receive the audio from the radio in some form to be able to get it back into the computer application so you can decode it and look at things on the screen. And if all of that's working, then that's a good starting place for where we're at this morning. From the perspective of trying to do the presentation, Dave and I ran into a small challenge last night, and we're going to try to get over that this morning. And Dave, I need you to enable, if you will, screen sharing for the one that's listed as IYN WSJT demo, please. So what's happening is I've got one laptop up and running with the application software. I'm actually using another one for the actual Zoom meeting demo itself, so I can talk to you and I can glance up occasionally and see your happy faces on the screen. Where we ran into a problem yesterday was not being able to go out and actually show the desktop and only be able to show windows. We're going to try to get over that this morning. And Dave, if you are still there, I am still not able to share the screen from my computer. I need to.
That's strange because it says you should be able to.
Disable participant screen sharing. There you go. Maybe it just took a little while. No, no joy. And we're on the one that says IYN WSJT-X.
Yep. Yep.
Well, that'll be fun. Tell you what I'm going to do, folks. I'm going to drop out of the meeting on that computer momentarily. You'll still be able to hear me. And I will join back in. Give me just a second.
So Dave, while Bruce is doing that, so for field day, if I'm operating my home station on battery, then I am one echo, correct? And then I can work all field day stations as one echo. Is that the way you read it?
No. I know I'm not Dave, but no.
And why is that? So home station on emergency power is a battery emergency power?
Maybe I'm wrong. Hang on. So echo is emergency power, or echo is, I'm trying to, I thought echo was EOC or other designated area, or is that Foxtrot?
Emergency power. Emergency power is echo.
Okay. My bad then.
So if we have our batteries installed by then, does that mean we're emergency power?
As long as you're operating it off a battery power, even if you're at home, it is considered, based on the guidelines that I've seen, that it is one echo.
So I might have to turn off the grid side in order to actually be completely on batteries. Maybe.
Okay, Bruce, we're now seeing your, whatever you're doing, launching.
We're actually seeing my desktop, which is what I wanted yesterday and I couldn't get there. That's cool. That'll make this much better. This will make this much more better. Let me bury a couple of things that I don't need to see. I don't need to see.
Yeah, behind the Zoom window, we can see your FT-8. There it is.
Oh yeah, this is muy bueno.
Much better than last night.
Yeah, so what you guys might need to do is if you're looking at your other Zoom screen like I am and you've got your participant panel up with little thumbnails, you might need to go out and kill that. On mine, it's on the left side of the screen. So I'm going to minimize that. So what's going to happen if everybody is a good citizen, which I expect most people will be, I'm okay with letting Dave leave the mics open and not muted. But let me ask for questions before we get to questions, unless you see something that you really got to stop me on and say, hey, Bruce, while you're there. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make sure that I'm looking at what I'm doing on the screen for the Zoom meeting as well as what I'm doing locally so I don't go too fast and that you can actually see what I am pointing at, opening, launching, doing, and I'm not talking out of sync with what's being presented, if that makes sense. So let's get started. So where I was at was you should hopefully have operating version of this.
Sorry, brief question. Did you want us to already have WSTJ running?
You don't have to. You can just watch along and do things. If you've got it running and you want to try to track what I'm doing in parallel, even though you're not going to be in a live session like I am, where I'm actually online with a radio and I'm on a certain band, and in this case, I'm on 30 meters, you don't have to be there. But you know what? For a couple of you, if you're actually online and you're live and you're on the same band that I am right now or am going to be going to, it might be fun to go out and see the interaction, even though we're all in a Zoom meeting doing this as well. Obviously,
Yes.
That's not the way it works in real life, but so let's run through it. So everybody should know what this interface looks like and what it is that you're looking at on the screen, right? This shouldn't be uncommon. And if it is, that means that you probably haven't installed the application yet. Again, the presumptions are that you've got operating rig interface. You are able to go out and get signal into the application from your radio somehow, and that you're able to key the radio and generate a transmission, which means that the computer is sending the signal in an audio modulated fashion to your HF radio, and your radio in turn is transmitting that and putting it on the air. So the basics of this are, and ignore for a moment how I've got colors and colored things in windows. We'll talk about that in a moment. The basic layout of the interface, and I'm moving my cursor slowly. This is the panel on the left side where you can see the time interval in UTC, where the last signal was received in a batch, which is 15 seconds long, if it's FT-8. You can see the relative signal strength in the top where it says dB. And signal strength in this case doesn't necessarily mean how many watts they're transmitting. This is how well the computer application, from a signal and noise perspective, is able to decipher the signal that is in question that you're receiving. The DT reference here on the top indicates how far off the opposing person's clock is from a timing perspective. And if you, as an example, see numbers on this that are very consistent where everyone appears to be a half a second or close to a second off, it's probably not everyone else that's a half a second to a second off. It's in reality probably your PC. And we'll talk about time sync in just a couple of minutes. The frequency is the one that's next to that. And this is where we'll stop for a moment. I'm actually going to turn the audio down on my radio in the background. I'm not sure if you guys can hear that, but I'll turn down the FT-8 toning. The frequency is a representation of the bandwidth that the FT-8 signal or this application is able to be transmitted. And I'm not trying to present this in a way that's super technical. I'm trying to use what I consider to be either beginners or layman's terms on some of this. So if you read the manual, the terminology may indeed be very different, and the specificity and what things are called and described as may be slightly different, but I'm hoping that I'm imparting the meaning in a way that is easy for folks to digest. So the frequency that's represented here is a tone, as an example, that station is transmitting on. It's not to be confused with this down here, which is the frequency, if you're watching where my arrow is. That's your USB dial frequency, which means in this case, I'm remotely controlling my radio from WSJT and vice versa. But that's the band that I'm on and the frequency that I'm on that band. That is the transmit and receive frequency for the application. The frequency that's referenced up here is effectively your unique identifier or tone selection that you're using to push the WSJT signal out over the airwaves on. And that can range from, in theory, 0 up to about 3,000 hertz, okay? So 1 hertz to 3 kilohertz. Most of the activity doesn't happen below 200 or 300 in most cases, and most of the activity does not happen above about 2.3 to 2.4 kilohertz. And part of that is a lot of the modern radios, even though they are very modern, when you're setting them up for utilization on WSJT, unlike sideband and unlike CW operation, in WSJT, you want the radio to receive as wide as you possibly can from an audio or a tone perspective, and not be super narrow focused, where if you're trying to do CW, and there's a lot of folks on CW, and you've got your thing dialed down really, really small for a very narrow filter bandwidth to maybe avoid receiving other people or getting interference. In WSJT, you need to try to be able to hear or listen from the software perspective as much of that 3 kilohertz bandwidth as you can. So roughly 2.4 kilohertz of that is what a wide filter would be in the sideband mode on your radio. Obviously, there are skirts, if you will, that's what they're called, on each side of that filter, where you can still receive outside of that. You just may not have quite the receive sensitivity because of it. So because of that happening, most folks gravitate somewhere between 300 to 400 hertz on the lower end of this, up to about 2.3, 2.4 kilohertz. But when the band is really crowded and full, and right now I happen to be on 30 meters, I'm going to jump to 20 meters in a moment for the demo. When the band is really busy and full, if you've ever done this and played with it, you'll see that, as the joke goes, there isn't a parking spot anywhere to be had where you can operate without either possibly colliding with and or interfering with someone else. And that's a challenge, to be sure, but that's part of how this operation works, and we'll talk about that in a bit. The message that's being sent is the next field in that left-hand box, and this is what's being transmitted by the opposing station and received by yours. This is very simple. It's limited in character length, as you can tell and already know. Usually it's comprised of the opposing party's call sign, as well as the other party they might be communicating with already, and what the status of their transmission is. So in this case, on that very top line, it said RR73. In this case, I've got a WL7CG. So theoretically, someone up in Alaska talking to someone in 8 land, and they're just concluding their conversation and saying 73. This is just what happens to be rolling by. If you are interested in watching what the chatter is, this is a great window to go out and see what might be out there. I try to identify what stations might be on the air, what geographic area that you're in. When you get to a point where you're really just looking for people to talk to and you don't care about that, there is a little tiny box down here, right below that left side window, that says CQ only. And if you were to click on that box and activate it, when the next pass comes up, which is 15 seconds, if you're looking at the lower part of my screen, it's just about there. The only thing that I should see that's going to be decoded from this point on are other stations that are calling CQ. So if you're only trying to focus on people that are calling CQ and you don't care about all of the other stuff rolling by, that's a handy window and a checkbox to go out and utilize. A lot of folks don't know that that's there. A lot of folks don't know that that exists, but that makes it simple to parse, if you will, or filter what's coming in for band activity information in the left window. So in my case, if you're looking at the very bottom of the screen, and I've done some configurations and setup to make this happen, but I'll explain why one of them should be, if you're looking at WL7CG at the very bottom, the guy that's in Alaska, and you look at the one that's right below that currently, which is WB4CIM, you'll see that one is bold and green or highlighted in green, and the other one is grayed out. The way I have my application configured and the way that a lot of folks do set up their software, and take this with a grain of salt. If you were, I'll step back. If you were communicating on the air and you were doing phone or CW operations, it is not terribly uncommon to work somebody multiple times just because you want to say hello to someone. It's a familiar voice on the radio. It's a familiar voice on the air. It's someone that you talk to on a regular basis or whenever band openings occur. Sometimes maybe it's once a year, twice a year. In digital and WSJT and some of the other modes that are not chat modes, it is not uncommon to fall into this thing where you work somebody one time and then you never work them again. I know that sounds silly because you might want to let someone know the band is open. You might want to just talk to someone in a WSJT and make multiple contacts throughout the year. But for a lot of folks, to keep the clutter down, and this is the way I've got mine configured. If you see it that's in bright green where I've got my arrow, again, I'm looking at Alaska. What that means from my computer's perspective is I haven't worked that particular person on this band. And if it's grayed out, it means that I have worked that station on this band. Now, what's also interesting is if you look at where I've got the blue bar that's in there, and I know this is kind of fancy sounding, but it really isn't. If you see where I've got the bold green, so for W9DF, it's bold green and there's a blue bar that's in there as well. What that means is I've never worked that call sign on any of the bands in WSJT. So where I was looking at Alaska earlier, where my arrow is again, that means I've worked him somewhere on one of the bands and it's logged in the application, but I haven't worked him on this band. And I've got it configured where I have an extension on that, where if I've never worked that call sign, not only do I get the green indicator saying to me, I haven't worked this guy, that also means he's not in a log anywhere on my computer for WSJT. So I've never worked him on digital. Why is that important? I'll tell you why that's important. And we'll laugh about this in a second. Rob, this is for you, my friend. My recommendation, and it's going to sound like a joke, if you are trying to collect award points, if you're trying to collect QSL cards, if you're trying to go out and collect anything, let's say it's field day, and you are trying to work all sections, my advice to you would be that you want to, beyond the shadow of a doubt, come out of the gate, and if everybody wants to laugh, you can. If you don't want to laugh and you don't understand the joke, it's also okay. My recommendation would be that you always try to work Delaware and Rhode Island and get them out of the way. Delaware and Rhode Island are exceptionally hard to get. I see folks all over the world specifically calling CQ for Delaware and Rhode Island, so it's not just us in the US, and it's certainly not just us here in California. So using this as an example on how I've got it configured so I know who I've worked and not worked, it would be important for me to know that in the case where I've got W9DF, again, where my arrow is, I've not only not worked him on this band, but I've not worked him ever at all. In the case of Alaska, where WL7CG is still on the screen, that means I have worked him on some other band, but not on this one. So if you're trying to backfill to get Delaware and Rhode Island or any other place that you may have not ever worked or that you've missed, this is an easy visual indicator of what that status is. Any questions on the receive side or what we just went through on the receive side so far?
Nothing is up so far.
Thank you. And Dave is moderating, by the way, for folks that are wondering. So he's watching the chat room and the chat queue. Okay,
I do have a question.
go ahead.
So on the right-hand side, it still shows left is band activity, right is ARES frequency. On mine, I'm not seeing anything over there. So what's going on the right-hand panel there?
If you've just launched your program, that means you haven't talked to anybody yet. So the right-hand side actually indicates activity that you've actually generated and worked.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So if you've never communicated with anybody and it's not doing anything, you're not going to see any activity there. So that's not to fear.
I haven't communicated with anybody today, but
Right.
I had communicated with someone in the past, and that's not showing up.
Yeah, and it won't until you actually have live activity for your current session.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're on a band where things are happening. So normal status indicators that you should be looking at, by the way, I'm going to break this out. I'm going to take the CQ thing off so you can see everything rolling by. Another reason why you might turn that on is when there are so many folks on the band all running digital at the same time that in my case, the screen that you're looking at is a 1600 by 900 screen. And you're seeing it scaled down to whatever your window happens to be showing. So I don't have a lot of real estate. It's not a gigantic screen. I can't really make the font smaller where I'm going to be able to see it easy, because if I make the font smaller, it's going to be hard to see. But it is entirely possible on a decode of a 15-second window where you've received everyone's traffic that's broadcasting that you can hear. It is totally possible that you will overroll what you're able to see in that left window without having to scroll up or down. Because you're looking at people that are calling CQ, you're looking at intercommunication status between other stations, which by the way is important because when you're transmitting, you don't want to intentionally step on someone that someone is already communicating with. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it's important to use it, but there are times when there may be so much activity that it becomes unwieldy. And you might want to go back to CQ only and just try to focus on people that are calling CQ that you might want to reach out to. The window below that shows what band you're currently on, and that should match with your title bar that you've got right next to it, or my arrow currently is where it says USB dial frequency. And if you go over here though, you've got some pull downs. And starting with WSJT version 2.1.2, which is what I'm running, and there is a more current version, plus a new release candidate that's out. Beginning with this one, it was kind of cool. They have listed here the normal frequencies that you'd be running FT-8 on, because this is the mode that I'm in. So everything that you're looking at on the screen for this pull down should represent the correct operating frequency that your radio should be on. In my case, I've got the radio controlled by the application, and because the radio is interactively controlled, if I push a button on the radio and change bands, it'll automatically change the program. So I'm not having to do two things. So if you have the opportunity to go out and interface the radio with the software, I always encourage that very, very strongly. It helps simplify a lot of the operations that might otherwise become confusing, especially in heavier traffic times and when you're getting started, it becomes frustrated, etc. So all of these list what you should be on frequency-wise. What was cool about this particular version when they popped it out was if you go up to the mode button on the top across the menus, where I'm at right now, if you were to click on that, you'll notice that FT-8 is highlighted right now, but I've got a variety of other modes. We're not going to really talk about these today. Might do this in a future session, but watch what happens. Well, maybe it won't do this on this band, but watch what happens, and it did. If I change modes to FT4, it knows that I've moved my frequency from 10.136 on my radio. I've gone up 4 kilohertz to 10.140. So if I was operating FT-4 on the 30-meter band, that's where I would be at. In previous versions, if you're running a previous version that's older than version 2.1.2, you could still do that, but you had to add those frequencies manually to be able to go out and do that and make it work. And somebody just probably dropped a suggestion to JTAlert and said, why don't we just go out and put that in there, that when you change modes, this is normally what we do here in North America, and it just changes frequency and we get down the road. So you don't have to diddle with things that you don't want to. So on listening only, your monitor button should be highlighted. If you choose to not monitor anymore, this is actually a toggle. You can click on that, and when it stops being green, yes, Jay, I see you in there. When it stops being green, I'm no longer listening from the application perspective. And what does that mean? If you've ever taken a look at your log files in WSJT, there are really two different things that happen fundamentally from a logging perspective. One of them is that you're keeping track of your logs with everyone that you've communicated with, and successfully, or, so if you've completed a QSO, completed a conversation, the log is committed and it shows the full exchange for that. But there's also another rolling log that's stored that is a record, if you will, of everything that you've heard on the radio. So what that means is that you're always accruing the information that's in that left panel, just as you're seeing it. And I can go back into a text file or a WordPad file or whatever else and take a look, and I can see a literal history of what was monitored from my radio. Part of the reason why the application does that is you may have a bolt-on program like this one that just popped up in the foreground called JTAlert. And what JTAlert does is it gives some additional features to the logging and capabilities of WSJT in that it can send data that's being received on your computer from the application to one or more logging programs and or websites. And the reason why that's kind of cool, we'll get to in just a moment when we do a demo on the transmit side. But effectively, this is your interface to other logging programs that you might be running locally on your machine, whether it's Ham Radio Deluxe, whether it's N3FJP, whether it's any of the other ones that are out there that are public domain or even commercially available. This is how you'd feed some of the data to it in addition to the program doing that for you. So I'm minimizing that. And I know I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock, and I know we started about 5 after, and I was looking at trying to get this done in maybe 45 minutes, but I'm trying to go at a pace where everyone's comfortable. So before we get to the right side of the screen where it shows what you've received and interacted with directly, the monitor button I just talked about, I'm going to light that back up so I can actually listen to and log and hear and see what's going on around me. If you want to erase everything that's on your screens, you can hit the erase button. And this kills everything that's in your right side window. So if you just need to clear the clutter, start from scratch, this is a good way to do it. And one of the reasons why that might be important is sometimes you'll want to scroll upwards and go back and look at who you've worked recently. And I did a system reset this morning, so I could have shown you some history from what I did yesterday and even the day before. But as an example, this morning, I worked somebody in CN88. I tried for that guy in Alaska, didn't get him, which is not unusual conditions. But I've worked a couple of folks this morning, and I'm scrolling down that screen. If I want to get rid of that and start fresh, I will simply do this, click on the erase button. Reason why that might be important is if, and to Jay, this is kind of where you were at, if I've interacted with someone and I didn't complete a QSO, sometimes it's possible to go backwards on the right side of the screen, scroll up to where that conversation broke or stopped, or maybe the propagation dropped out, maybe you got stepped on by somebody else. And within a reasonable time frame, you might be able to go backwards and highlight and click on where you left off in activity and complete the QSO without having to do it completely from scratch. And if you've got a lot of junk and a lot of data there, that might be harder to go out and do. Decoding, if you want to manually decode things, enable transmit, that means I'm ready to transmit. If I need to stop my transmission immediately because I've made a boo-boo, I can stop it there, or if I think I'm interfering with someone, I can hit the halt button. So even if I am transmitting for 15 seconds, I can stop the transmission. The tune button is kind of cool. This is just a single tone. It's not you sending WSJT info. This is handy where you might have an automatic tuner on your radio that's turned on and enabled, or you've got the tuner on your radio already turned on, or external tuner turned on, whatever it happens to be. By pushing that button, you are just generating a tone and some RF, so you can activate a RF sniffing or RF power tuner. And that's kind of handy, but it also goes in conjunction with this lever all the way over on the right side. The one that's labeled power is interesting. When you do your configuration, do your setup, do your radio stuff, if you are doing this by the book and by all recommendations, I've got indicators on the far left and I've got indicators on the far right. The one on the far left that says RX, you'll see that's got that green bar that seems to be going up and down a little bit, but it's hovering just about 70%. That's about where I want my receive audio to be to optimally be captured by the program and hopefully decoded. All the way on the far right where I've got the power lever, that does two things. That is actually the audio power output that's being generated independently by the application and not reflective of the sound card or the audio settings on your computer. So this interacts with those settings, but this does not control those settings. Ultimately, the power lever that's all the way on the right side is what determines how much audio signal is being pushed into your computer. And then between that and your audio controls on your computer, what's being pushed out to your radio to generate whatever amount of applicable power. You may also have on your radio a power selection, which most do, whether it's a knob, control, touchscreen, push button, whatever. So you've got 2 or 3 different places where you can fall down very easily by having the wrong setting configured, where you're either overdriving the radio or you're not getting 100 watts out of a 100 watt radio if that's what you're trying to do. Instead, you've got 15 or 20 watts that doesn't seem to want to go any higher than that. My dog is bugging me, so that's why I'm pausing occasionally there, because I'm trying to pet him and make him happy, but he's not happy. And that was the pounding you were hearing in the background. Sorry about that. That was my dog. The adjust audio transmit level, you always want to try to drop this in the middle and then work your audio controls either on the computer and or on the radio to go out and give you your selected power output. If you were really putting out low power, if you really wanted to go out and adjust your power output, you could crank this up by raising the indicator. The chances are very likely that while you're doing that, you'll also be generating some unwanted interference, and it'll be a very fat signal that people don't like to hear and see on the bands. The important safety tip I wanted to impart for that as well is when you go to tune, and I'll do this for the sake of doing it. Right now I've got my radio selected in tune. You'll notice that the power level indicator dropped. You can actually have an independent setting for the tune function, and it won't show up until you hit the tune button. When I remove this or unclick this, you'll notice that it goes back to where I normally would have the transmit enabled. So there's 2 different power selections here. If you want to go out and create minimal interference on the bands, select your tune, drop your power down to whatever's really only necessary to get your tuner launched and activated. And that way, when you go back to transmit, you're transmitting at whatever output power you really want it to be rather than the same power or whatever else. But there are two different functions there. One for the tune, and then you saw the indicator just jump back up, one for actual transmit. The rest of the interface, we're not going to get into and dive into. You should be generating standard messages in a default config for just getting started. And you'll see what those are right here. You'll see the very last one at the bottom is what should come up for your call sign and your grid square that you've configured when you set the application up. Here's the important safety tips before we even get to transmitting. And these are super critical in my book. And a lot of folks may or may not know about these or know about at least the gentleman's agreement and or etiquette around these. So here's a super important safety tip. And I'll ask a question first. Does everybody know what the term search and pounce means? And Dave, you'll have to referee that.
I guess if you do hit the yes button at the bottom of the, if we click on the participants list, there's a yes and no button. So far I got 3 no's and no yeses. Well, we're getting some yeses now.
Okay, so I'll cover it just for the sake of grins, not super long. Search and pounce is a mode of operation. And what that means is in digital applications or even in phone applications, if you're at field day, as an example, and this is where I get interesting looks because I don't encourage people to do this. If you're at field day and you operate in search and pounce, what that means is that you are always spinning the dial on your radio, so to speak. You're always going up and down in frequencies. You might even be changing bands. And what you're doing is you're looking actively for another station that's on the air calling CQ. And you hope to be able to respond to that person that's calling CQ. So what you are doing is you are always chasing down or trying to search and then pounce on someone that's calling CQ. That's generally what this implies. The alternative is that you are trying to run the frequency, which means that you look around on a band, you look around in a certain segment of a band, you try to find a clear spot, and then you start calling CQ, and you stay there and continue to call CQ and let other stations respond to you. So there's running the frequency that I just described, and then there's search and pounce, which means you're not trying to run the frequency, you're not trying to hold or stay in the same place. Instead, you're just chasing around looking for everyone else that's calling CQ. That terminology is important in digital as well, because one of the general beginners boo-boos that's made very often, and it's unfortunate, a lot of stations will, and if you look at where I've got my arrow right now, underneath this one section that says hold TX frequency. What that means is that when I'm transmitting, I'm always calling on that tone. I'm always calling on that frequency. I'm going to be doing that over and over and over again. I'm not going to move and go anywhere else. And I'm going to let other people call me on 1675, using the example that's on the screen right now. If, by chance, I'm calling somebody, and I'll stop the monitor for a second so the screen doesn't move on the left. If, by chance, I wanted to call K7UYN, which is this bottom entry right here, and I'm in search and pounce, and I do not have my hold transmit frequency button checked. If I click on this guy to try to work him, you'll see that his tone frequency is 2018. What's going to happen is my tone frequency that you just saw at 1675 is going to change to 2018 because I'm not set on my own. I'm going to acquire his, and he and I will both be talking on the same tone. When he's done talking, if I then go back and call CQ and I enable my transmission, which is where I'm at right now, and turn it on, I've acquired his tone and his frequency, which would be 2018. And I can actually show you this, but it would be showing it to you and it would be deliberately causing a problem. I'm going to be transmitting on what he was using. So now I've basically done a hostile takeover, or I've hijacked where he's transmitting, and I'm now interfering with other folks that he's trying to communicate with, and vice versa. So it's a super easy thing to remember. If all you're doing is searching pounce, and you are always going after the folks that are here on the left side of the screen that are calling CQ, you can leave that hold TX frequency unchecked and never worry about it. But if you are ever yourself going to start calling CQ, I'll show you what you need to do right now. And this is where it gets fun and frustrating at the same time. So I'm going to turn my monitor back on so I get some live data coming back in. One of the screens that comes up and one of the panels that will come up when you launch the application is what's called the wide graph. If you've ever used any of the PSK programs, this should look very, very familiar. There's nothing really alien about this. And I'm noticing on 30 meters, there's not a whole lot of activity right now. So I'm going to jump to 20 meters. Give me a second. I am going to tune my antenna tuner and get that going. Okay, so now I'm on 20. I think somebody noted this morning the band conditions weren't incredibly terrific, so mileage may vary. We'll see what happens here. Okay, so if you're looking at WSJT bar graph that's coming through now, what you're seeing is you're seeing a graphical representation of what's on the left panel of your WSJT application. By color that you're seeing, the more red the color is, the stronger the signal is. So when you go from almost no trace, which is yellow, to bright yellow, to orange, to red, that indicates stronger signals as opposed to weaker. Wherever you see a trace coming down from the top where the bar graph is represented across the top for the scale, that represents the tone frequencies that we talked about in that left panel. So if you saw someone that was like right here, so that's about, what, 1150 perhaps, somewhere in that area. Ooh, look, Sweden's there, looking for North America. It's probably this guy right here. It's probably W9JA. That's at 1132. That had that strong signal that we're looking at that was right in about here. You can correlate what's happening. You'll also see that the signal is a certain width, if you will. So that represents what they're transmitting on from a bandwidth perspective when you're sending a signal, and that also represents what you're going to be sending. So this is where it gets weird. This is 20 meters. It's pushing, you know, almost 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning. Conditions are not that great. This is actually a really slow day. If it was morning, conditions were good, and especially later in the afternoon, this would be just side to side, chock full of signals, many of them overlapping, and there's not really any way to avoid doing anything about that. It's just gonna be a mess. Your goal, if you can, to make things easy, is to select a portion of the spectrum that's available to you where it doesn't conflict with anybody else. That'll give you the best results for both transmission and reception of your signal. And sometimes that won't be possible. Sometimes there's going to be collisions and there's not anything you can do about that. This is where it'll get a little bit weird, folks, and I apologize. If you look at where the brackets are right here on the top, where my cursor currently is, this is where I'm currently set the transmit. So this represents my 1675 that I had set. And you'll see that there's somebody in there already. I don't want to conflict with them. And if I look over here, I can see just a very light shadow of something happening. Someone's in there, they're consistent, I can see it. I may not be able to read all of the traffic and the data there. I can see where someone historically was here previously. You know, the goal is to try, if you can, and it's not always possible, find a space where you can operate and it's in the clear and you don't run into anybody else or bump into anybody else. Also, probably a good idea, if you can, to not be right next to someone that's super strong, because the chances are that your signal, if they're DX, if this guy here is all the way out in the left coast somewhere, sorry, all the way out on the right coast somewhere, maybe Rhode Island or Delaware, and I'm trying to get somebody in South Carolina, if this guy is super strong, the person that's also in that same geographic area may not hear me because they're going to be hearing this guy. Even though we're on separate tone frequencies, even though we're, you know, theoretically not transmitting at the same time, this guy may, just like anything else, wipe out someone else's receive on the opposing side. And I know that's a super oversimplification of the effect, but that happens as well. So I'm going to try to find a clear spot here, and I can do it by punching a number in. I can scroll down using the up and down arrow keys where I'm at right now to go out and do things. In fact, I'll minimize my window a little bit here so you can see it shifting while I do it. And you can see that slide to a place where I'm hoping for a little bit of activity or not as much activity. And I'm doing this to optimize my opportunities to be able to be heard and also to hear things without interference. So I moved down from 1675 to 1525. I'm not seeing anything there, but remember, I can also look over here in this left window, and do please let a couple of the 15-second cycles go by to try to get an idea by looking at the numbers where other people are at. Just take a look and make sure that where you think you've selected that you want to be operating isn't already really being consumed by somebody else. And this can change literally from second to second, minute to minute. When band conditions change, this will change as well. So it looks like the closest person that I've got to me is someone that's at about 1542, and it could have been that station in Sweden, who knows. So now that I've done that, I found what I think is a relatively clear space. I'm going to select, as I mentioned, hold transmit frequency. So I'm not going to be doing search and pounce. And I'm going to finally get to where I'm pushing the magic button that says enable TX. And I've also selected, and we didn't talk about this, there's a transmit even and first or odd and second. This is kind of a gentleman's agreement, and it all goes out the window when the bands get very, very full. But in general, the HF plans for digital generally show if you're in the United States, you uncheck that box in general. I'm not saying it's gospel. If you're in the US, you uncheck the box, so you're transmitting odd and second, because remember, you're interleaving 15-second intervals, and where you start is important. If you are in Europe or the other countries outside of the US, generally speaking, they're going to be transmitting even and first. So, hey, look at that. Someone locally, K6AQ, was waiting for me, or responded and saw me and has sent his thing back. And you'll watch, as I like to call it, the progression of the communication over here go up and down the Jenga stack. So I started calling CQ, popped up on the screen, he responded to me, and then I get a confirmation window pop up saying, do I want to log this QSO with K6AQ? Here was the start time, here was the end time, this was the mode, this was the band, this was the signal report that I'd selected. And if you want to, you can put comments in here, by the way. You can actually add things. So if you wanted to go out and actually kick out a physical QSL card later, your notes will be in here. So that's why you've got fields for the operator, the exchanges that were sent, things like that. If I simply click OK, this has committed itself to my local log on my machine, and I'm done. So I called CQ. I'm holding that transmit frequency, but I can also wait for anyone else that's here and just call them directly. So I have no idea how good the bands are right this second. But I'm going to try for N7 PIB and Charlie Mike 88. And I just realized that when I did all this stuff, I'm actually not on the better antenna for 20 meters. That may be part of my issue, but we'll change it if nothing happens here. But let's try to give this guy a call and see what happens.
Bruce, question.
Go ahead.
What happens so if you're on the wrong TX even first, do you not hear people that you should be hearing?
What'll happen is if you're transmitting actively, you're only going to hear the people that would be normally received by your transmit cycle that you started up. If you're not transmitting, you're seeing everyone in the left panel, whether they're odd or even. And if you haven't selected anything here, let's do this for fun. Note that I'm still holding my transmit frequency because I always want to hold my own. I don't want to split. Hey, by the way, that guy heard me. Let me log that really quick, make that go away. If you're transmitting even or first, you're only going to be hearing the people that are odd and second replying to you. And as you're continuing the transmit, that's all you're going to see on your screen. And exactly the opposite would happen if you were doing the opposite. But if you're just listening like I am right now, everything that's going by, every 15-second interval, I'm going to see and I'm going to hear. And for some strange reason, this guy may not think that he heard me completely. So
Okay, so I don't see your CQs, but I could make a queue with Monir a little bit ago, but I'm not seeing you calling CQ.
I was on 20 meters. Are you on 20?
Yep.
Give me a second. Let me make sure this really happened. The guy that's sending me the RRR sounds like he's concerned that he didn't receive my 73, so I'm sending him an additional 73 to make sure he's got that. Right. And give me a second. I'm going to change antennas while I'm done transmitting here. Obviously, I'm not going to do a hot swap on the antennas while I'm transmitting. That would be bad.
Yeah, I see you and he going back and forth.
Okay, I'm on a different antenna now.
So I see your Roger, Roger, Roger to him.
Yes. And that, you're not going to see me on my side showing that. If you look at my screen, I sent him the signal exchange. Effectively, everything where it says generate standard messages and below in that box section right here, you should see the full communication happen.
Right.
If there's a piece of that that's missing, maybe you got stepped on, maybe someone closer to you was there, who knows? It's concerning that he's continuing to send me RRRs. That basically means he's not getting my 73. So I'm going to do one more time just for the sake of grins to let him know that we really did do that. And then we'll move on.
But I have to have my TX even first check the opposite of yours. So
not to receive.
Not to receive. Okay.
If you're just sitting there idle and receiving, you should be hearing it, seeing it. It should be there. Shouldn't be any issues. And I'll end it here. If he continues to send RRRs, I'm just going to say sorry about that. So the band is actually relatively quiet right now. There's not a whole lot of folks that are on, as you can see by looking at the bar graph. But I'm expanding my screen up a little bit. Is there, hang on a second. Stand by, folks. I've got background here I need to take care of for just a moment. I'll mute my audio. All right, that was a cat management issue problem, and it's all good. Sorry about the delay. We've been through the interfaces. We've talked about how things are configured generally. Let's do one more thing. I know we're kind of jumping into the operations. I know we're pushing the hour, but let's look at a couple of basic things that happen in the settings menu that might be of interest to folks that are getting started. If you open File Settings, it should put you at this panel. Everyone should have this. If they've got it running, they probably know where this is already. This is where you would have done your basic configurations to get your radio interface up and running. The most important things that are here really are your call sign and grid score on this first one. It's an amazing thing how many HF operators don't drop the grid score in. So when you're working them on 6 meters and above, you have no idea what grid score they're in and you're working. And it's, for most contests, that means that it's not a valid QSO. It's kind of a problem. Things that I have selected that you can actually change if you want to. J, as an example, between decoding periods, if you're not sure when a decoding period started or ended, you could put a blank line in there by checking that box. I like personally seeing what the distance is that's displayed in miles. So if I've got a grid square from the receiving side, when I go to that first panel and they pop up, I see the call sign that I was working. If I've got their grid square, it gives me 2 other pieces of information. One is a beam heading. So if I'm running a directional antenna and you're looking where my mouse cursor is, it's going to give me an azimuth. And granted, it's going to be rough based on just your 4-digit grid square, not a 6-digit. It'll be at least close, right? So if I'm trying to work N7 PIB and I had a beam antenna, I'd be pointing my antenna at him at 322. And he's roughly 534 miles away from me. So that tells me how far my signal is making it. In some cases, you can guess at how many hops you went out and made. So having the grid square is really important because it gives you this additional information on the opposing side's interface. And if they've got it for you, it gives you that data. I don't mind seeing transmit messages to my RX window. You can change that and play with that and see what the interface looks like. And this is the one that's really important for me. And I was trying to explain this coming out of the gate. I want to see whether or not I've worked a station ever on any of the bands on the application. And I also want to know what my worked before status was. So that's where you see the green bar, or sorry, the green call sign and grid score highlighted, but also where you see the blue bar that keeps rolling by on the left side. That means I've never worked that call sign, not just on this band, but not on any band using digital. Behavior of how the interface and the buttons work. I like using the double click on the call, sets the transmit enable. So let me close this for a second. I'll come back. If you don't have that checked, you would need to go out and select who you want to talk to by clicking on that person that's calling CQ, and then you would have to do a second step, which is enable transmit to make it work. In my case, the way I've got this configured, and let's pick on this guy right here. Or as I scroll by, I'll pick on somebody else. Hang on. If I double click on KN6FDP, who's always on the air seemingly, just because I clicked on him twice, it automatically enabled transmit. and it'll come up in the right interval for whatever he was transmitting on. So he's actually operating even in first as opposed to odd in second. And by clicking on whoever's calling CQ, you're adopting whatever cycle they were in.
Wow.
So let's see if he responds, but we'll move on after we get through this. I didn't want to have him receive a call from me and then me disappear on him while he's trying to call me back for the next 5 minutes. That's not proper etiquette either, even for a demo. If he doesn't respond in a couple of minutes, we'll walk away.
Well, he responded to me.
Okay. So there are other messages that can happen in here, and he did respond. It's coming up on the screen. You guys should be able to see it. In case anybody's wondering, for my digital radio, I'm running a Kenwood TS480HX and an external tuner. So it's a 200-watt radio. Usually I run the power between about 10 to 25 watts, usually 50 when things are kind of slow. But there are times when it's late night, conditions are not good, that, you know, you'll pop the power all the way up and I'll be putting out close to 200 watts off the back end of the radio into the tuner. Most of the time you can really get away with 10 to 50 watts and it'll work just fine. Thing that you need to really watch out for is to make sure whatever radio that you're using is adequately cooling itself, because it's not that it's a high duty cycle, it's 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, but it's enough to cause some issues if you're not keeping an eye on it and the temperatures are hot inside your shack or your house. So I want to stop for a second. This was a good break point to go out and talk about messages, and we'll go back to the configuration panel in a second. But I'm taking advantage of the fact that someone just did something special, and I talked about this early on. See the message that I've highlighted right now says CQ-DX. So from the calling area that this guy is in, he's in the United States. He's calling anyone except the United States. No different than you would do if you were doing this in CW or in phone. So if you're calling on phone and you're saying CQ-DX, you know, KG6IYN, I'm not looking for anyone domestic at that point. I'm not trying for anyone in North America. And DX sometimes, to be gracious, could be Hawaii, and it might be Alaska. But generally speaking, I'm not looking for anyone in the continental United States. There's a couple of ways that you can make that happen. If you go down here to your prescribed fields, you can actually set up different fields and different traffic sets, but you can also very easily edit this and just push in DX with a space. And now I've modified my first calling message to be CQ-DX and my call sign KG6IYN, Delta Mike 12, which is right here at this very bottom field. Here's what gets weird. If I were to respond to KA4JON and Echo Mike 84, and I'm in the US, I would expect one of two things to happen. Well, there might actually be a third. The first thing to happen is that he's probably going to ignore me and not return my call. And I'm going to think that my radio is broken or not working. Even though he's plenty strong maybe, and he should be able to hear me and work me, he's not responding, so something's wrong. Well, he's calling for DX stations. You're in the US. You're probably going to be ignored. That's probably the most polite thing that could happen. The other thing that generally happens when this occurs is the folk that's calling CQ-DX, especially if it's in Europe or somewhere else, and they're specifically calling for Colorado, they're calling for another country, they're calling for another entity, whatever else, and you try to call them because they're rare DX or there's some station in another country that you haven't worked, they're generally a little more harsh, and they'll usually come back and say, only DX or only this or only that. And you could tell by the short message they send you back that they're pretty upset that you're bugging them. And part of the reason why is because every time they're trying to listen for that other entity, you're in there trying to respond to them. So it's potentially interfering with what they're trying to do. I guess the third option is that the guy will work you anyway, even though he's asking for DX and you're domestic or you're continental US, maybe he's going to work you anyway and just get it done so you go away and you don't annoy him anymore. So that's kind of an important thing to watch out for. If someone's specifically calling for Rhode Island or Delaware, and you're in California trying to call him, don't do that. Let the guy try to work whatever he wants to. When he's done working DX or calling for Delaware, you go back down to your message again, and either you've changed your macro or how you've got it set up, or you simply remove the DX and you go back to a standard CQ and everything's good and everyone's happy again, okay? That's an operating tip that's really important as well. Go back to settings. So we were on the first panel, we talked about double clicking on that call sign to go out and make it happen. Here's another one that's important, but is only used when you're operating 6 meters and above in a contest. If you've ever been in WSJT and you've seen someone on 6 meters and above, and sometimes in error on HF, if you ever see something that comes across your screen that says CQ test, and then it has the call sign and the grid square for the person, what that means is they have clicked this box, they have turned on that feature, and what effectively happens, I'll move this box over to the side so you can see. When you enable that and click OK here, what happens is you remove the exchange that is what you received them at and what they received you at. So instead of having 6 particular chunks of a conversation to complete a QSO, you've effectively dropped the 2 elements that give you the signal strength that was received and sent. And what that does is it shortens the amount of time it takes to complete a QSO, because doing a signal exchange is not required for VHF contests or VHF communications. It's good to know, it's good to have, it's great to make a reference to, but it's not a required element as part of the exchange. If you've ever been in an HF contest, you know the joke. The joke is everyone is 5'9". No one ever bothers to go out and say, yeah, you were about 3x2, or you were about a 2x4. No one ever does that, because in some of the HF contests, you're supposed to record the signal strength and the quality of the signal, and you'll always hear 5'9" Delaware, 5'9" California. You always hear 5'9". Everybody is 5'9". In VHF stuff, not required. In microwave stuff, not required. So instead of taking 1.5 minutes to complete the entire operation to get a QSO, you can actually do it in 1 minute. And it shortens the interval, it takes advantage of propagation changes, and maximizes the potential for you to go out and make a contact. So when you're operating in a VHF and up event and you see people with CQ test, that's why it happened right there. Everybody should probably know. Go ahead, question.
Jay's got his hand up.
Jay.
Yeah, what was that question? Okay, so there were these standard messages, and you go down the process. So does it start at TX1 and then progress to TS6? Or if you're calling CQ, how do you initiate calling CQ, and does it always start at 6?
It always starts at the bottom where you're calling CQ. If they respond to you, then you jump to the top of the stack.
Okay, very good. And then how do you initiate calling CQ?
By pushing the enable button if you're going to be calling and holding. If you're calling someone else, then you can go over to this side like I was showing you folks earlier,
right,
and double click on someone that is calling CQ.
Okay, so you push the whole TX frequency and then enable, and then it assumes you're calling CQ. There's no button that says call CQ now.
Correct, unless you just hit enable.
Right.
And you're still going to wait for your appropriate interval, whether it's even in first or odd in second, right?
Right.
It's going to wait for the appropriate interval before you start. So there isn't a jump in the middle. There's occasions where you might have clicked on someone late after the cycle started and you're 5-6 seconds into a 15-second cycle, theoretically. They're not going to complete receiving what you sent them because there's not enough time in there. And in that 15-second cycle, roughly 12.5, 13 seconds of it's used. If you've ever noticed, when you click, the audio stops before the 15-second window does. So there's a little bit of a buffer in there. So if you start late, you might be able to still get someone, but if you're more than 2 seconds, you're probably not. And that's why that whole time setting and time sync piece is really critical. In WSJT, if you're more than 2 seconds out and you show the offset as being more than about 2 seconds off on either side, you're usually not going to be able to complete the communication correctly, so it won't decode correctly. And what's an interesting aspect of WSJT is the weaker the signal is, the more the offset is, the less likely you'll get a successful decode. So when you're working folks that are really weak, it is super important that your time and their time is spot on to enable the best opportunity to be able to go out and pull the signal out. That was probably too much information, sorry. Most of these for radio, audio, and setup, we've already talked about, and you should have already done. If you want to create your own macros, this is where you would do it. And you could literally pull these up. So if you have any special messages you want to put in, you can go out and do it that way. For reporting, in my case, I've got it to set, as you saw, it'll pop a window up letting me know I've completed it, and I have to click OK to make that window close. So it's prompting me to log my QSO. I do add the signal report to my comments, so I keep track of that. If I needed to go out and send someone a physical QSL card, I can tell them what it was that was happening on my side. Other things that are here, I've got my enable PSK recorder spotting, which is part of JTAlert. We'll talk about that in just a moment if people have got time. And then just the general settings that are configured to go out and make JTAlert and other external logging stuff happen. This is all going to be stuff that's boutique to whatever it is that you're doing for your logging on board if it's separate from WSJT, or your reporting if it's going to be to an external party. But let's go to frequencies that we talked about earlier. Just to touch on this, there's not anything you're going to change here. This will show you what the frequencies generally are in the different regions. And like I said, in 2.1.2, there's not really anything to change. In previous versions, you'd be adding things, you'd be putting additional frequencies in, you'd be putting in custom frequencies if you were doing FT4. If you were in a country that recognized by gentleman's agreement that they've got 3 or 4 FT-8 frequencies. So if one of them gets really congested, they go up 4 kilohertz or 6 kilohertz to somewhere else, you can add those in. So when you're using the program, it's point and click. But generally for us in getting started, if you're just cutting your teeth on this, there wouldn't be anything here you'd want to change.
Question?
Go ahead.
Okay, so back in the general tab, when you enabled VHF, UHF,
Yeah.
you click it on, but then when you go into the band select on the screen, 20 meters or mine only goes up to 6 meters. So how do you select something higher?
Dun, 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 dun.
Oh, you go higher than mine does.
What
Okay, I'll
version?
check it out. Thanks.
What version are you on, sir?
I'm using the experimental, whatever it is one.
If you're on the latest RC one, it may not all be in there yet. They're really,
Yeah, I'm on the latest, RC.
yeah. So they're not completely done with that yet. I would expect that you're going to see at least 2 meters in that when they get it as a regular release. They've already got a number of errata items that are fairly significant they need to go out and work on for this. And I'm sure that they're going to be able to get a lot of things in there. There was a hope that before we got to the VHF contest in June, we'd be at a release version, but it looks like there's probably going to be an RC2 version before. It will probably be an RC2 for the VHF contest, and I'm not sure I'm going to recommend going there. We'll talk about that. But the hope still is that there will be a new point release that'll be a regular point release before field day. And maybe a lot of this will change right before that happens.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. So going back up to file configuration, settings, this is the part where, for me, this was super important. Under colors, and you can tinker with this to get the behavior to be anything you want. As mentioned on mine, this is how I've got it set up, but this is by no means the only way to set it up. And you can scroll through them. You can see what options were set by default. And you can also go out and add things in there. This is where I configured it to go out and show me, as an example, whether or not I've worked somebody previously and whether I've worked them on a band or not worked them at all. So I can see at a glance, here's a call sign that's not in my log anywhere. And it may not just be on a specific band, but it may not be anywhere in the application. So if I've got, in this case, I've got 160 meters through 2 meters setup. Where you saw those blue lines, that means I've got no one in that left side where you saw that blue line going all the way across the screen. They're not in my log. So I might want to add that person to my log, and then I see them on other bands. That's how I backfill and get them for other bands. So if you're working HF and you're working for a band specific worked all states, that makes it easy for you. You'll know that you've already worked that party, and you'll know that you've already worked in potentially another band, but maybe I don't have them on 40 meters and I need them. And that also helps you kind of keep track of, you know, things that you're going after for goals, if that's what you're doing. So this is where all that would happen. I've got mine set where I'm only showing grid fields that I've selected, and I'm including the worked all, you know, the worked all entities section there. You can play with all of that. If you're ever curious, and this is just for fun, and this isn't a complete log, but this is the log on this computer. If you're ever curious about how many stations you've collectively worked so far, I'm going to tell you to look where my cursor is, because somewhere down here on the very bottom of the screen, you're going to see magic happen. If I hit the rescan my log file, on the bottom of the screen, it's going to show you for at least a moment how many stations I've worked on this instance. So it was 6,200 stations I've worked. That'll just give you kind of an idea of how much stuff you've got in your logs. I would also always recommend very strongly that you copy your logs off periodically and store them in places. Jay, you had a question.
I did. Regarding logs, so WSJT keeps its own separate ADIF logs and then might also transmit them to whatever logging program you have installed. Is that
Correct. That is correct.
So it's always there, and you know, unless you have some automatic backup mechanism like, well, I'll use the Mac thing, you know, Time Machine. So that's going to get updated periodically or backed up periodically anyway. But you're suggesting maybe copy it off by year just for giggles?
I try to copy mine off weekly. That way, if I lose it, it isn't really lost. If the computer decides it wants to go out and take a solid state hard drive dump, it isn't really going to be lost. So if you're looking at what I've got on my screen, this is a Windows session, by the way. If you've never done this, this is actually pretty easy. And the name right here is going to be the name of your computer or the name of the computer that you're logging in on, right? So if I go to, in this case, Windows, users, name of my computer, application data, in this case, should be local. And then WSJT-X. And I'm just going to let everybody dwell on this. If you've never been here before and you're good with mouse clicks, it's super easy to get to. But effectively, if you need to move the application to another computer, clone your configuration and your settings, and do wonderful things with it, this is the directory that you need. If you were installing a brand new version of WSJT on another computer, and you want to move everything, including your logs, this is the directory that you'd want to go out and move. Now, what you'll see at the very top of the screen now is a folder that says Save. Don't be misled by this, and really isn't a save folder. What this is, and what this represents, these are the sound bites every 15 seconds that have run by on your computer that your computer has heard and stored for you. Sometimes you'll be able to roll backwards and historically look up a log or figure something out, but in general, these are things that you don't need to keep, and they build up over time. So in my particular case, I've got 2,911 of these guys. Sometimes in the samples file, it's just a samples file. Periodically, you want to dump this because what this does is burn hard drive space on your hard drive. I've seen people that have had 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000. And what ends up happening is because you're continually writing these sound bites to this folder, your machine can start running slow. You start filling up your hard drive. You're trying to figure out where your hard drive space is going. Periodically dump everything below the samples line and just get rid of it. And that'll help keep the thing moving quickly and keep you out of the danger zone from running out of hard drive space. But everything else that's on this screen is what you'd want to go out and grab and copy, or maybe just keep a backup of. So if you were just to copy this part to a USB stick or to an external hard drive, you've preserved your configuration, you've preserved your logs, you've got everything ready to go. So if you were going to pop a new version onto a machine or a laptop or whatever, and you just dump this there, other than the machine name right here needing to be changed in the INI file, everything else would work. ADI files are exactly like you'd normally go out and get for output from other logging programs. Your WSJT logs are here. All the stuff that you need is right here to make it fun and to be able to go out and make sure you don't lose things going forward. Questions about operations from anyone, or what we've covered so far that you may not have already have known? I know we've already done a couple of quick communication things where we've done demos, if you will, but does anybody have any other comments, thoughts, questions, stuck on something?
Thanks for walking through the preferences. I missed a little bit in the reporting. Can we go back there just to take a quick look? And thanks for the tip to check the various boxes in the ways that you had them, because that was very interesting. It's the PSK reporter spotting. You have some other software installed. This will broadcast to that will then go back to the web and do spots.
So how many people know what 127.0.0.1 is?
Localhost.
There's no place like home.
Yeah.
That's your local machine. So basically my server is my local machine, and any other application will be sourcing that. So I'm acting as my own server, but I'm only serving to myself. I'm not dishing anything up to the internet. So in this case, I'm actually providing information to JTAlert, which is right here. So if you're also running JTAlert, and this will take us into our next segue, so this is good timing, Jay. This will show you what I've done since I've set the application up on this particular machine. It'll give you statistics that it's logged. It'll tell you what you've done on what band, in what numbers and what volume across the intervals that you've worked. And I'm actually kind of surprised that I've got as many numbers on 6 meters that I do on this machine. I didn't know that until I just looked. That's pretty funny. JTAlert's a totally separate topic and probably for another day, but this effectively just becomes your interface to the outside world. Here's where this gets cool. I'm on 20 meters right now. I don't necessarily have any expectation that I'm going to talk to anyone, but maybe I will. If anybody is on locally that's listening to the call, I know I'm going to be calling CQ, but do me a favor, don't respond. Let this run. My goal here is to transmit for a couple of minutes, maybe. Let's give it 1 or 2 minutes. So this is the first 15-second cycle. And what I'm doing is I am calling CQ. Someone might actually respond to me. That's totally possible. But what I'm going to show you is what you do to figure out where you're being heard. And that's based upon part of the interface that's here within WSJT and sending data out. It's also part of what JTAlert does. And these are cool features to let you know whether you're potentially wasting your time, or maybe the band is wide open and no one's taking advantage of it, which is very frequently the case. So let me go out and give it a couple more transmit cycles. Any questions while I'm doing this briefly on what we've already covered so far? And again, this is just an intro. These are basic operating tips I'm trying to throw at people. I'm trying to provide some of the entry-level things that I know a lot of people cut their teeth on and got confused by, especially the part about holding the transmit frequency. There's almost nothing more frustrating than when you've been operating on a set frequency for a long period of time. You have someone pop up that's on the East Coast that just worked you, and they go from working you to calling CQ, and now they're on your tone because they didn't have the hold TX frequency set, and they didn't pick a place that was clean on their side. To be honest with you, this is just like field day. This is just like operating in any other phone contest or CW contest. There is always going to be every frequency in use when the band is busy and propagation is in. You really have two choices, and it's literally just like real life. You either fight or you do the flight, right? You either battle it out or hold the frequency that you're on if you've got someone else that's in contention with you, and hope that they go away. But the likelihood is if you guys are beating each other up and you're both on the same frequency, you're using the same tone selection, then you're not going to be very productive about working other stations. You just won't be. So you've got to make a choice to either, fight or flight, cut or run. Either you're going to abandon where you're at, pick another frequency that appears to be clear, and hopefully get productive again because there's no conflict. And there's a lot of reasons legitimately why that could happen. You could literally have propagation open up between here and another part of the state, or here and another part of the US, or here and some other country. And there may have been someone on your tone or very close to it running in a different country that has been doing the same thing you were doing. Maybe you've been running for 15 minutes or a half an hour or an hour or longer, and suddenly the propagation's there and you guys are beating each other up. That's, that happens. That's no one's fault. It'll occur. And again, you've got a choice. You can either beat each other up and not be productive and not work anybody, or you move frequency. Someone's got to be agile about it and just move on and pick another place to operate. So here's what I'm doing. I've called CQ a few times. You're looking at my stack here where I'm running my arrow up and down. Now what I'm going to do is open up a browser window to one of many different locations that are out there on the internet where I'm sending data to, letting them know what I've heard, which would be stuff that's on my left side. So I'm actually reporting things to these propagation reporters. And if you look at the left side of this panel, these are calls that I've heard from my radio as I've been listening. These are all stations that I have been able to hear how long ago it was in minutes. And bear in mind, there might be a minute or two of latency in getting your data out to the website and having it actually be turned into stuff that you're looking at. So this is near real time, but it's not real time. It's very close in most cases, but it's not going to be in these 15-second windows. And in most cases, if you look at the top, this site refreshes every 60 seconds automatically. And I'm 210, it should refresh now. And there, I've got additional information that just popped in. So the left side of this is folks that I've heard that I'm reporting to the internet. And the right side of this are people that have heard me. So I was in these transmit cycles that I'm in the midst of right now. I'm being heard by folks in the United States. There's Chile, being heard by Canada. Korea's in there. This gives you an idea of where your signal is reaching. And in a lot of cases, this will give you an idea based upon the signal strength, how well the opportunity is going to be that you might be able to work them. And in a lot of cases, another thing that you might consider doing, I saw the raised hand, by the way. In a lot of cases, what you might be able to do and what does happen is if you're not transmitting, and I'll stop for the sake of stopping. If I'm not transmitting, but I'm listening and I'm reporting, sorry, and I'm reporting. So these are calls that I've spotted, right? These are people that I've heard. So on the very top of that list, AF6JO knows that I'm hearing him. So this guy here, where my arrow is, knows that I've heard him. He knows that my radio is listening. Now, this is where it gets weird. There may or may not be a human there. A lot of people just leave their stations running and receiving, so they're providing propagation reports, which are handy. But every once in a while, you could literally have someone call you, even though you're not transmitting and you've never transmitted. They'll pop up out of nowhere, and you're thinking to yourself, how the hell does this guy know that I'm out there? Well, it's kind of a Hail Mary. They don't know that you're there or not. If you haven't been transmitting and you're not active, they don't even know that you're out there. But if you're a state that they need or a grid square that they need on VHF or UHF on a certain band, they might be doing a Hail Mary, and because you're receiving them, they may directly call you even though you've not ever transmitted. So in a weird way, that's kind of cool, but for a lot of people, they're like, how the hell did anybody even know that I had my radio on? Well, it's because they're looking at a propagation report like this. Bob, you had a question. I thought I saw a raised hand pop by. Someone will have to moderate for me, so I'm not in the admin panel.
Yeah, Bob, N6RLG, you had a question?
Yeah, Bruce, thank you. Just a quick backup. How do you get the wide graph screen up? I missed that and didn't get a note on it.
If you've launched the application, that should launch automatically with the application.
Okay.
So if you're looking at your toolbar at the bottom and you got the app loaded in its default configuration, you should have two panels that you can select. So if I'm down at the bottom, I've got my actual app that I'm running, but then I've also got my bar graph over here. If it's a Windows machine, it should come up that way. And there are features and ways to go out and play with this as well. That's probably for a future session too. So that was one website that was cool. Another one, and this is what I really enjoy. Here's another one that represents the information differently and actually shows your gray line opportunities as well. So I was on 20 meters. I'm on this website, and we can provide links later. We don't need to go out and dwell on this now, but we can dump all this data out to the group later. I'm on 20 meters, so I need to select 20 meters. I want to show signals that were sent by a call sign, which is mine. And in this case, I'm doing all modes, whether it's FT4 or whatever else. And then over the last 12 hours, and I'm going to select go. And this usually takes a minute or longer to go out and populate, depending on how busy it is. So here is what it's already displayed. And this will refresh automatically every 5 minutes. So from what I just did on 20 meters, I had 426 reception reports. And right now there are currently 1,777 people that have their computers listening on 20 meters, and they are effectively pumping data into this database, into this website. So everywhere that you see a balloon that's got a time on it, that's how long ago they heard me on the band. And if you hover over that, you'll see on your screen exactly what the stats were, which is really super cool stuff. So in this case, it'll tell you that I was received in Hawaii. The grid score was Bravo Lima 10. It'll show you that the mode was FT-8. It'll show you what they received me at, which was -9 dB. It also gives you the distance and the bearing. So again, if you have a beam antenna or something that's steerable, it'll give you a place to point. So the reason why these are cool, again, it lets you know whether you're wasting your time or not. The band could be wide open and there just may not be anybody on. And if that's true, then you know you can get out there and start calling CQ. You can also, again, like I mentioned on the previous screen, you might consider doing a Hail Mary, which is, I know this guy received me, his call sign was Alpha Hotel 6 Sugar Zulu. I might consider just trying to call ad hoc CQ for this guy and see if he's actually out there watching his radio or watching his computer, and he might respond. Obviously, where this gets weird is when we have time offsets geographically, and other countries are 8, 9, 10, 12 hours ahead of us. They may not be awake, so you might get flustered. Again, this is kind of a Hail Mary thing, but if you need a grid square, if you need a country, if you need a section of the United States, something like that for an award or a contest, sometimes you could throw the Hail Mary and sometimes you get lucky. I'm being heard in South America. Looks like I was being heard over here in Japan. Looks like I was, oh, even 12 hours past, I was being heard down in New Zealand, Australia area. So this will tell you, again, historically and even up to the moment, what you were doing out there on the bands and give you signal strength. You can zoom in on this, by the way. You can recenter the map. I'm not trying to make anybody seasick. I'm just trying to go out and get a little bigger picture. So as an example, if you're doing this on 6 meters, this is where it would get interesting, because obviously there's not going to be as many folks that are on usually, but it'll give you a good representation of where you were heard, how you were heard. And again, it'll even give you details. If the other station is giving you grid square, which this is, and you were on 6 meters, you know that you needed Delta Mike 65 on 6 meters. And here's a receiving stations out there listening. And I know we're not on 6, we're on 20, but use the 6 meters as an example. You know, again, the Hail Mary thing is very legitimate. A lot of people will be out there looking to see where they were heard, and they'll cross their fingers and hope that someone's actually on the air and listening and start calling them out of the blue. So again, even if you haven't been transmitting and you suddenly have someone calling you, they're not stalking you, they're getting your data from your computer, and they're hopefully leveraging it to go out and make a contact that they need. So there are a lot of these different propagation websites out there. There are a lot of them that display the information in different ways. And the cool part about this is that you're pushing data out to the internet on these things that are just, you know, awesome data resources to figure out where the band opening is and how good it is. And as this one shows, it even shows the gray line propagation opportunities as the overlay. So as you zoom out, you can see where you are in relationship to the sun moving across the different continental bodies, which is also kind of a nice thing to have. Looks like a couple of folks with raised hands. Rob, Dave, can you broker that?
I think Bob was first.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, Bob, your hand is still up.
Okay, so I'll go then. In the settings panel, reporting, enable PSK reporter, you got 3 checkboxes: accept UDP, notify on UDP, and accepted UDP request restores window. Oh, so what do those mean?
Usually those are configured depending on what you're trying to log to, Jay, and what the interface application is. And that's usually outside of the WSJT app. So if you're running N1MM as an example, which is a very popular ham radio logging program, N1MM will scrape the data from that local server. Most of the bolt-on applications that take the logs off will tell you what your settings need to be. And if you actually go into the user manual for WSJT, it'll give you that information as well.
Okay, so just turning that on just does a localhost broadcast. It doesn't actually send anything to the internet. There's some bolt-on that's going to actually send things for send spots.
Correct.
It's not WSJT that's going to do that.
WSJT does pieces of it natively, but no, it doesn't do all of the elements. So
okay, because I went to the PSK reporter and found that I had some things logged after I turned that thing on. So that was interesting.
Yep.
Okay, good. By the way, MacLogger DX integration works too.
Cool.
So.
Anyone else? I know we ran super long on this, but it sounds like everybody hung in there. It's just a lot of stuff to cover even as an introductory. And when we get into the more advanced stuff, it's really fun at that point. Any other questions? That was kind of a soup to everything. But I hope I provided some operating tips that'll help people that are getting started on it. Some of the things that certainly tripped me up when I first got it started on it. And candidly, you'll probably run into other folks that are not aware of some of the things that we talked about this morning, and they're doing things inadvertently, and they're tripping you up inadvertently because they just didn't know any better. Everybody starts, especially the part about the hold transmit frequency after you've found something that looks like it's reasonably clear for you to operate in. That's probably one of the biggest boo-boos that most people that are just getting started make, is they'll be out there doing search and pounce, and then, hey, I want to call CQ now. And the unfortunate byproduct is that now you're clobbering the guy that was your last contact, and you've taken over whatever tone he was already running on and using for whatever period of time. That's probably the biggest one. But again, don't be surprised if suddenly you start getting interference, because propagation comes and goes. And today just seems to be particularly slow. But if it was 20 meters in any other given day of the week, and as things start happening, a lot of the collisions that occur are just because propagation popped up and you've got someone near you that wasn't near you before. It's not intentional. Well, I hope that was helpful for some. I know that's a leader into what, the 12 o'clock rally time. So any other questions that I can possibly answer? If not, we can definitely throw things out in email as people have a chance to go out and tinker and play perhaps, and maybe we can field some things offline. And shy of that, we can always do this in the future as well and get into some of the more advanced modes and operations.
And Rob will have this posted probably by tomorrow. Send a link out to where it is. So if you want to go back and review some of this stuff, it'll be available.
Bruce, a lot of good material. Thank you very much.
Anything?
Hope that it helped. All right, thanks, folks. Thanks for hanging out.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Bruce.
All right, take care, everybody. 73.
All right, if nobody else has any other questions or anything, we'll go ahead and close the meeting, and look forward to talking to everybody on the radio. And we'll do another Zoom in 2 weeks when we have our
I think Dave got hung up.
Yeah, he abruptly dropped out, didn't he?
Oh, did I drop out all of a sudden?
Yes.
Dave has left the room.
Hey, I saw
right.
that. I'm actually looking at the chat panel really quick, if Monier's still on. You know what? This is kind of a weird deal, and I'm not sure what it is. And I'll share with you some operating problems that I've had. I can run 17 meters without a problem on phone. I can run 17 meters if I wanted to on CW. If I run 17 meters on digital, my Samsung refrigerator goes absolutely nuts when I hit about the 70-watt power level. And it goes nuts in a different way depending on what tone frequency I've selected. So something in the refrigerator is actually decoding what's happening as these tones are overlapping and doing things. It's actually causing something in the logic in the fridge to go nuts. And if I forget to go back and check the refrigerator when I'm in that kind of a situation, I'll find out that even though the panel looks like it's working, the actual refrigerator and freezer are not operating correctly. And I'll come back and see that the freezer, instead of being, 20 below zero, is suddenly 15 degrees above zero. And it's like, uh-oh, what's going on there? Ferrite is your friend. I don't know what it is in the signal encoding and modulation. I mean, I do know, but I don't know in this case what's causing the fridge to go out and do nutty things. But I've got AT&T Uverse for internet service. And I was actually exceptionally surprised that in all my work and all my digital stuff, I've got wire antennas that run parallel to the feeds coming in the house. It's regular twisted pair. coming in the house off the pole and off the pole drop. I don't have fiber yet. I was expecting 100% that I was going to have all kinds of internet dropouts whenever I was doing anything HF or otherwise. I was very surprised that I do not, but I've heard other people that do. So the bottom line is ferrites are your friend. And it usually what happens is the RF usually gets into the laptop or the computer, and you'll see people that have the USB cables wrapped through multiple layers of toroids or mat, or wrapped like heck to a large toroid. Even the power to the USB hub, if you're using one, usually it's the computer that's the victim. It's usually not the internet service, but you may need to go in there and play toroids everywhere that you're doing stuff, or maybe even reorient a little bit where your feed line is going to your antenna, especially if it's end fed and the coax is your counterpoise. There's all kinds of things that could be going on there, but not unusual to have that happen. And for whatever reason, even though other modes don't seem to affect it, you get into digital and it suddenly causes things to go bonkers.
It's just the local spy technique. They're just watching you.
Well, that too. It's also 5G, but we didn't talk about that today.
Hey, I just went fiber, so now I've been told that my computers, even though they were taken from an industrial site, are not fast enough to handle what is being brought to the front door. So I still get a little buffering, and they said, well, if your computer was a little faster, it could handle faster stuff, it would not do that. However, most of my buffering has gone away, so ultimately, I guess I'm going to have to do something about getting the computer speed up.
Yeah, and I didn't mention that as far as the application goes today, but that is a common problem as well. Generally speaking, a third or fourth generation Intel processor with at least 4 gigs of memory, if you're not running anything else that's significant for applications, that's probably going to be fast enough to run WSJT under high volume conditions. But if you're on 20 meters and there are hundreds of signals out there, which can happen, the decode may not happen soon enough after that 15-second window goes by to be able to see everything in real time and process it. So I've had that actually show up on a couple of other folks' computers that were using laptops or desktops that they'd retired from regular service and put them back in as dedicated machines to go out and run digital stuff on their radios. And we ended up having to go out and increase memory to 8 or 16 gigs to go out and let stuff happen in memory quicker. In a couple of cases, we went from conventional mechanical hard drives to solid state drives to improve the I/O between the actual machine and the drive itself. But if you were running in a super high volume environment and you've literally, like I said, got hundreds of signals, not just maybe several dozen at one time, you can actually run longer than that 15-second window is on an older machine before you start deciphering and decoding them where you can actually use it. And that's problematic, but that's another issue. Anyway, everybody get on the HF rally at 12 noon. Thanks everybody for playing. I told I told Dave that it would probably run at least 45 minutes, not, having any questions. And as you start talking through it, I was trying to do it methodically and slow enough that people could digest as we went along and ask questions. I hope the pace, even though we went longer, was still sufficient to get everybody the information that they needed. So once again, thanks everybody for hanging out. It was fun.
A quick question, if you don't mind,
Sure.
not dealing with the subject, but rather the loading of the processor, the program. And that was, it gave me 2 options, one for 32 and the other for 64-bit. I went to my system information and it tells me I'm an X64, but that the directory is a Windows System 32. Now, what does that tell me?
Doesn't mean
Am I a 32 or a 64-bit machine?
Depends on the other applications that are running too and how the processor's running. Generally, if you're even questioning it, try running the 64-bit first, try installing it. If it comes back and it says, nope, can't do it, then you know you got to drop it back to 32. That's usually the easiest way to go out and sort through that.
Okay.
It doesn't need to be fancy. Always try 64-bit first. If it's right, it'll work. If it doesn't, then you load the other one and you move on.
Thank you, sir.
You bet.
Well, thanks for the help. I've got a little learning curve to get going here.
You know, the funny part about this application is it's really cool from the perspective of you can take advantage of very short windows where propagation's not good. The part that I didn't reference, and I probably should have, was where you were looking at the received signal strength. And when you hit 0, if you're -0 that you're hearing the other station at, that's probably the lowest threshold that you might ever be able to establish a voice contact on reliably. And that's if conditions are perfect. Obviously, the more positive you go, the better chances are that the voice or phone capability would be there. But when you start dipping below 0 and you start getting in the negative numbers, that's a station that, while they might be perfectly workable and strong enough on digital, you're probably not going to be able to work them on voice. It's just not going to happen. And when you start getting past -4, -10, even if they were CW, you may not be able to have worked them on CW, as simple a format as that is. So everyone's mileage will vary. Everyone's receive antennas and radios, and even the sound card interface factors into what you're able to receive from a sensitivity perspective and capability perspective is. So if you've got a better sound card and you've got a better radio and receiver and you've got a better antenna, you might be able to work people at -20 as an example, which is considered pretty weak, really weak actually. But someone else with a lesser antenna, lesser radio, and maybe even a built-in audio card in their computer that's not necessarily as good, your -20 that you're hearing, they may not be able to hear at all. So it isn't just a radio or an antenna thing, it's also a sound card piece that factors in. And the better all three of those components are, the more likely you are to be able to work weaker and weaker stations. And you eventually get to a point where it's a point of non-reciprocal return. I might be able to hear someone that's -20, and this happens a lot actually. I might be able to hear someone that's -20, -21, and they're in Indonesia and they're 8,000–9,000 miles away. And even though I'm able to hear them, they're not able to hear me because their radio, their computer, their antenna may not be as good as the stuff that I'm running. So even with equal power, even if propagation was fair on both sides, they may not be able to hear me because something on their side is not the same. So everyone's mileage will vary, and the usual rule, just like EPA mileage, is your actual mileage will probably be less.
A little piece of information on that. Back in my telephone days when I was working special services, the requirements for how noisy a circuit were, of course, this was analog at the time, as far as the medium between spots, was you had our level was random noise, and a 0 dB random noise was approximately 88 dB below 0 dBm.
Okay.
And so the requirements for a circuit that was going to carry voice,
yeah,
was one level. Right. It varied with the layout of the circuit, but for digital, it was always the boundary was 12 dB lower.
Right.
And a 12 dB lower or noisier signal would be considered a perfect digital signal, just as 12 dB better, quieter would be considered a good sounding audio signal. So that's kind of factor that I've always kept in mind. And when you see some of these various data sets out there now that, there we go, are out there, if you try and listen to it on the radio, you can tune right through the station and not know it's there, but the data set will say, oh, there's a friend I can talk to. It can pull the data out of all that random noise that you can't, as a human, detect a pattern. It just sounds like anything just off channel.
I have been there many times. That's one of the interesting aspects about WSJT and that waterfall as an example. You can adjust the sensitivity of the waterfall to show a lot of things. I've got mine set to where if I can see something on the waterfall, it's usually going to be workable. Usually. Not a guarantee, but usually workable. There are often times that I'm working stations that are not even visible on the waterfall. So here I am trying to find a place that I was showing folks earlier to operate from, transmit from, and not interfere with anybody else intentionally. And in some cases, they may be weak enough that you're probably not going to collide. There might be someone close, but you're not going to collide. At least you're not going to collide terribly. But in other cases, I can't see anyone on the waterfall even show up. And yet I'm out there working them and they're minus 21, minus 22, which is super fringe. It really is. Anyway, I'm going to run. I'm going to get something to eat. I skipped breakfast. And I've got that dog that was thumping in the background. That was him actually leaning up against the chair while he was scratching earlier. So that was funny that the speakerphone picked that up. And I've actually had that happen in the background where I've had a cat that was 3 or 4 feet away and purring. And the cat has been the star of quite a few Zoom and Teams and other Skype related meetings where it's like someone's either got a motorboat running in the background or someone's got a really happy cat that's sitting in their lap. It's always interesting.
I'd like to recommend, incidentally, just for the quality for both hearing and talking, anybody that can get a headset, by all means do it. Computers pick up fine, but the ambient noise and the ambiance that you don't need can be eliminated if you use a headset. Plus, you hear better too. Yeah, you can have other noise in the area, and it's not distracting you. All
true. All right, folks, I'm going to bug out. It's 12 noon. Everybody should be on HF if they got HF. If they don't, hopefully otherwise. See you, Heather. Everybody enjoy the rest of the day. Maybe we can go out and do this again and get into more detailed stuff later and show some people some additional things on the other digital modes that are also part of that package, which are kind of cool. Take care.
Great.
Happy Saturday. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, Bruce. And we'll go ahead and close this, and I'll get the recording going so we can get it over to Rob so people can review some of this at their leisure. Thanks for being there.
Bye-bye, everybody.